Die horde harnash. Welcome to this video, which is going to be a quite shallow explanation, an introduction, let's say, just so you are aware of the spelling of mutations in Irish, and so you're aware of what types of mutations there are before I go on to explain the pronunciation of every consonant in Irish, and before, in the future, I also make individual videos explaining each type of mutation in depth, giving lots of examples and familiarizing you with them. In order to define mutation, I have a little definition written down just to make it extra clear. So, you understand, in Irish, the first consonant of a word may change depending on what type of word comes directly before it, right? This is called a mutation. And there are 4 types. Mutations can also be sticking something to the front of a word that begins with a vowel. And that still counts as a mutation. I'm going to quickly run through each of the 4 types just so you're familiar with them, and I'll give 2 examples each. Example words that cause that type of mutation, and so you can look at the spelling and you'll know which exist, and so you're not surprised later on. The first one I'll talk about is the easiest, and it's called H-fix. So H-fix actually affects words that begin with vowels. 2 words that cause H-fix on words that begin with vowels are le, meaning with, and a, meaning her, as in her, car, her, house. So, to give 2 examples of this mutation in action, it's really simple. Let's take the word madra. Madra meaning dog, which doesn't start with a vowel, obviously. If I wanted to say with a dog or her dog, I would just say le madra, a madra. But obviously we don't have to worry about that. That word doesn't start with a vowel. But if we wanted to say, for example, with bread, bread is ran, and ran starts with a vowel. So I would have to say, instead of le ran, le haran. And let's say, for example, if she had a fish, the word for fish is iusk. And if she had a fish, I wouldn't say a iusk, I would say a hiusk. That's it. It's very simple. Moving on to the next one. Eclipsis. I've mentioned eclipsis before. Eclipsis can affect words that begin with these consonants. So eclipsis is a mutation that affects consonants. It affects words that start with these consonants. And any word that starts with these consonants, when eclipsed or if eclipsed, becomes spelt like this, right? So P, a word that starts with P becomes eclipsed, then it's spelt with a BP. A word that starts with a B, if it becomes eclipsed, then it is spelled with an MB at the beginning. When pronouncing this, obviously it looks a bit complicated, but it's not that hard. When pronouncing a word that has been eclipsed, what is pronounced is the new letter that you've added, right? And the original first letter is only left there, only remains just to show the reader what the original word was, right? So, I'll give 2 examples. If we have the standard word for house is tach, and I want to say in a house, right? The word for in Irish is I. And it causes eclipsis onto any word that can take it, right? So if I want to say in a house, I'm not going to say I tach, I'm going to say I dach, right? There, what I'm pronouncing is just the new D, and I'm keeping the T there, not because it's being pronounced, but because it's easier to glance at this phrase and recognize, okay, I'm talking about a house. My second example is on, or if you want to pronounce it that's fine as well. On means on the, and this also causes eclipsis. So if I have, let's say, the Irish word for a bus is bus, and if I'm on the bus, I'll say on mus rather than on bus. This practice of keeping the original word spelt the way it was and just adding the new pronounced letter is the opposite of what Welsh does. So the Welsh word for a town, Bangor, can be eclipsed, or their version of eclipsis, under certain circumstances into the word Mangor, but they don't keep the B there. What they do is they swap out the B for the newly pronounced letter. So I think that way of doing it is a little bit more confusing because it's hard to recognize what the original word was. You just have to know that it's being mutated. But what I will say about pronunciation, is that eclipsis does not produce unique sounds. So MB, TD, GC, let's say, they are just pronounced however you would pronounce an M, a D, or a G, right? It's not like GC has a unique sound. They are pronounced the same you would already existing consonants. Unlike the next mutation that I'm going to talk about, which is the most common and the most important, lenition, right? Lenition is basically the softening of a consonant at the start of a word, right? These are the consonants that can be affected by lenition, and when they are lenited, they're written with a H after them, right? In the old spelling, instead of a H, so this is the modern way of spelling lenition, they would have been written with a dot on top of them. Some of the lenited sounds, so some of these are actually new, unique consonants, right? So BH, for example, isn't pronounced as you would any other consonant sounds. It is its own new sound. And important to mention, any lenited consonant or any eclipsed consonant still has to be pronounced broadly or slenderly. So GC, let's say, an eclipsed C can be broad or slender. It can be pronounced as a broad G or a slender G. Same with BH. It is a new sound, but you can still find a broad BH which has its own pronunciation, or a slender BH which has its own pronunciation. So just to get into some examples, two words that cause lenition, or that lenite the next word, are mo, which means my, and ro, which means very. So the Irish word for friend is cara, cara. And if I have my friend, I'm not going to say mo cara, but rather mo chara. Same thing with the word for big. The word for big is mór. And if something is, ro means too, as in too much. If I want to say something is too big, I'm not going to say it's ro mór. I'm going to say ro vor. And I'm going to explain in my upcoming videos how to pronounce every lenited consonant, because they are, most of the time, unique sounds. The last mutation I'm going to talk about, which I left to the end on purpose because I'm not really going to get into it, it's quite complicated, is called T-fix, right? So T-fix only happens for some specific types of words after the word on, which means the, right? And you'll see T-fixing on words that begin with vowels, like on taran, or on words that begin with an S. Some words that begin with an S, like in the phrase on tamwit. T-fixing also can happen after the word sa in some dialects. Not all dialects, but in some dialects, sa means in the, and it can cause a T-fix as well on words that start with an S. However, I'm really not getting into it because it's not really straightforward. T-fixing onto words that start with vowels, for example, is really very different and doesn't happen in the same contexts that you would T-fix words that start with an S. This is because T-fixing words that start with an S is technically a type of lenition, so that should actually be grouped with lenition, whereas T-fixing onto vowels is kind of its own thing. What they have in common is that they both will occur in every dialect after the word on. But other than that, T-fixing on S's versus T-fixing on vowels is really a different thing. They just look similar. And that is all I have to say. I kind of have a thing against using Irish words to explain Irish grammar. So if you do hear the Irish terms for these mutations out in the field, you'll hear eclipsis being called uru and lenition being called shehu. The last thing I will say is that getting mutations right in writing, when writing, can be quite important. It would be a little obvious if you're getting mutations wrong when writing, but when speaking, it really is not majorly important. If I want to say I'm on the bus in Irish and I'm talking to my friend and I'm in a rush, let's say, and I say time at a bus, technically I'm wrong. Technically I've made a mistake. I should have said time at a bus. But is that me using a different word? Like, is the meaning lost? Is my friend gonna go, what are you talking about? What's Edam bus? No. Most of the time, mutated words like mus or chara or vor, they don't sound like any other words, so there won't be any confusion if you get it wrong when speaking. It is a nice touch. It obviously is technically correct when speaking the language. It is good grammar, but if you miss a mutation, like, people will understand it's really hard to keep track of. There are lots of rules other than the rules that I just mentioned in this video. And yeah, like, I'm sure nobody gets them right 100% of the time. So, Sinead, slán go fóill, that's all you need to know when thinking about the mutations that exist in Irish and how they're spelled. And I will explain them all in greater detail later. Slán.